My wife's skin has always been irritable. She's had bouts of eczema since she was a young girl, and there's an endless amount of things that seems to set it off. She explained her struggles to me early on in our relationship, so I understood why she took pills in the morning and was constantly slathering on medicated cream. I barely even noticed when spots popped up unless she pointed it out to me. They're just dry red patches, at most the size of a dime. I've seen a few scattered highs and lows, times when she's self-conscious because she's scratched a spot a little too much, but nothing even remotely comes close to what's been happening for the past few weeks. See, it started small. She always gets worse at night. She told me that it's difficult for her to stop in the evenings, when she's left to her own devices in the dark and she can't see the damage she's doing to herself. I'd hear her scratch in the bed, and she'd get up, as she normally would, to trek to the bathroom and put some cream on whatever spots were bothering her. She got up for a second time that first night, and I started paying more attention. I heard her pacing back and forth in the bathroom for a while before she returned. "You all right?" I said quietly as she made her way back to the bed. "Yeah," she muttered, clearly irritated. "My arms are bothering me." She cuddled up to me, and I tried to keep an ear out for any scratching so I could keep on top of her while I was still awake. We both fell asleep without much issue that night, but for the next couple of days, she wore long sleeves and practically carted her medicated cream around the house with her. The evenings were long for a few days. She'd come to bed, get up after a short while, pace around the bathroom, return to bed, and if at any point I heard her scratching, I'd gently remind her to stop. She'd curl up to me with a resigned sigh, and eventually fall asleep. That was only the beginning, and although it seemed like she was getting better at the start of a week or two, that's when the true nightmare started. She had more trouble sleeping than before, and was constantly getting up to go to the bathroom, sometimes staying there for an hour before returning to bed. I could tell that she wasn't sleeping even when she did come back to bed. I would drift in and out of sleep, and the sound of shuffling and scratching would sometimes rouse me enough to try and help. "Please stop scratching, hun. You're gonna hurt yourself," I'd mutter. She'd huff at herself in frustration and wiggle herself closer to me. Sometimes I'd try to act like a barrier, and she'd curl herself like a jigsaw in my arms so she couldn't get at herself. I woke up before her one morning, happy to see her sleeping. Her expression was a bit sour, like she was having a bad dream, but better a bad dream than no sleep at all. Or at least I thought so. The lack of sleep was getting to her, more so than me. She still seemed tired when she woke up, and she moped around the house miserably, getting ready for work. It was sad to watch. I wish there was something or anything that I could do to help her. Maybe you should take the day off. You've had a hard week, I suggested, carefully. But she was already shaking her head before I'd finished. "Sitting around the house with nothing to do will only make it worse," she sighed. "It's better to keep myself busy so I'm not picking at it during the day." "Should you go to the doctor?" I tried, bracing for her to disagree. She stayed silent for a long moment. "Maybe on the weekend. I need to go to work," she resigned, looking more at the floor than at me. I had a creeping feeling that she wasn't telling me something. It's hard for me to judge her state, but accepting that she might need help must have meant things were pretty bad. She told me stories about when she was younger. Had less self-control, scratching the backs of her knees at school until they bled. Obviously, she was better as she got older, but when she gets stressed sometimes, it still bothers her. She told me vague details about an incident while she was at the university. It got so bad that she ended up wearing long sleeves and pants for a month in the summer to hide most of her skin. She said she tried to deal with it on her own, but once her parents accidentally saw the backs of her legs and the insides of her arms, they threatened to take her to the emergency room if she didn't go to the doctor to get it fixed. That was when she started taking prescription medication. If it was getting bad enough for her to seek medical help, I hope she could make it to the weekend without dealing too much damage to herself. She left the house and I went upstairs to make the bed before I left for work. A heavy stone of worry settled deep in my chest when I noticed the red streaks on the sheets on my wife's side of the bed. There wasn't much blood, but some blood was still too much. She'd been so self-conscious recently that we hadn't really done anything sexual in a while, and I tended to respect her privacy when she was feeling this way. She'd been wearing long sleeves and pants every day. It was fall, so I didn't think too much of it, but it must be worse than I thought. I decided I'd make her show me the damage that night, and if it was getting too bad, I could drag her to the hospital that evening. As planned, she came home. I told her briefly about the small blood marks on the bed. She was immediately nervous and tried to shake me off, telling me it was fine. I kept at her until she relented. She pulled the sleeves up her arm with a small wince. The underside of her forearm and inside her elbows was a bit raw and red, but it had already started healing. There was a thin film of healing skin over some small areas that looked like when you skin your knees as a kid. It must have been where it had bled earlier that morning. I'm still on top of it, I swear I am. In the dark, I might not have noticed if I scratched it a bit too hard and it bled a bit. I'm gonna put some gauze on it tonight so it's protected and I can heal faster. I know I looked worried. She tried to offer a small smile to appease me, but it wasn't working. The patches were large, much larger than I'd ever seen, like something was eating away at her arms. I swear I'll go to the doctor's on the weekend. The most they'll do is get me some stronger cream. Sometimes I get some really strong antihistamines for the evening that put me to sleep. I promise everything's okay right now. I'll be fine for a few days. My lips pursed, but I eased up on my harassment with a sigh. I hope so. I don't like seeing you like this. You haven't been sleeping, and I miss seeing you smile. She flustered at that and dismissed me with a small smile. I forgot to ask if there were any more spots besides the one on her arm. The next few days were the worst. I could hear her muttering to herself now at night. My sleep was restless, and I did everything I could. I tried to get up out of bed to comfort her, but she'd lock herself in the bathroom or snap at me to go back to bed. My insides churned as she paced and spoke to herself in quiet tones. The most frustrating were the periods of silence, like a kid that's too quiet. I could tell she was doing something bad. Those were the times I tried to interrupt, as often as I could. Her responses were always unsteady and emotional. I tried to tell myself if I'd snapped her out of it once or twice, maybe enough to delay whatever she was doing to herself. I was exhausted, so I would fall into small periods of sleep against my better judgment. I would tell the exhaustion was getting to her as well, but in a different way, and it was driving her insane. Sometimes I listened closely at the door to hear what she was saying. After a day or two, I could hear her clearly. Scratch. Feels so good. I can't stop. I have to stop. Scratch. No, I can't stop. I can't do that. Scratch. It's okay. It's not. Scratch. It was heavily unnerving. I could hear choked sobs breaking through some of the words, and at times it sounded like she wasn't talking to herself, but was defending herself from some unseen demon trying to convince her. My resolve strengthened. I had to do something about this. She couldn't wait another day. I didn't regret what I did. There was nothing you can say to convince me it was wrong. I drugged her. Crushed up a couple of sleeping pills. I put them in a tea. She drank it, and she was out like a light on the couch by 10 p.m. I sighed in relief. I gathered her up in my arms. I hauled her upstairs to the bedroom. I quickly called her work, left a message, letting them know that she wouldn't be in tomorrow. The part I dreaded the most was changing her into her PJs, but I knew that I had to see what she'd done to herself, how bad it had gotten. Her clothes stuck to her skin in some spots like glue, and as I gently pried them off, sadness washed over me in a wave. She'd been suffering. It had taken me this long to truly take the actions she needed to recover. Patches on her arms and legs were still wet. White, clear fluid leaked from gauzes on the backs of her thighs and arms. Blood leaked from a few scabs I peeled off while removing her clothes, her body attempting to heal and fused with her clothes during the day. Her immune system was fighting. It looked like a flesh-eating disease had taken over her body, disintegrating patches of skin like someone had splashed her with acid. Bandages were scattered across her arms and legs, but she hadn't changed them throughout the day. They had been bled through and fused in the healing process as well. I worried about infection in some of the larger patches, as I thought this was terrible, and it couldn't wait. I dressed her wounds to the best of my ability, stayed up for hours applying ointments and bandages to the places that were the most healed and wouldn't stick. I exposed as much as I could to the air. I put a fan over her overheated skin and let her body do the work. After a few hours, I was satisfied. Put a shirt and some underwear on her so that she wouldn't wake up naked and terrified. I was worried that she would wake up before me, so I set an alarm. Gave me a few hours of sleep before I would wake up and check her wounds again. I hoped that they'd dry out so I could bandage some more. I was so exhausted. And there wasn't much else I could do until her skin had some time to breathe out of her constricted clothes. I did a lot of research on the pills I'd given her, and for her size, the amount I'd given her should have knocked her out for a solid 8 to 10 hours. Should have. I was groggy. See something rousing me from before my alarm. Scratch, 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 tear it out! A cry struggled its way out of her throat, and I was instantly awake and terrified. It was dark, and she couldn't be awake, but I heard wet scratching, and her dry throat croaked out commands. Stop! Stop scratching! I could barely see. I jumped out to get the light so I could see and lunged to stop her hands. I yelled out in a panic when I turned on the lights and saw her hands at her face. No, stop! She was clawing at her face. I grabbed her wrist as words and choked sobs streamed from her lips. Itchy eyes, take them out, take them out, take them out! Her hair was clumped in bloody patches across her forehead from being torn out. Deep nail marks tore through her skin and muscle and crumpled up bandages along her arms. The tears streamed from her eyes as she struggled against my grip. Please, stop! Stop! Please stop! I begged as she tried to rip her arms away from me with surprising force, constantly muttering nonsense. Her eyes were bloody and leaking some sort of clear gore from tearing her own eyes open. I cried, I begged with her as she chanted and struggled, and I knew I had to do something. My phone was on the night table. I managed to wrestle her tiny wrists into one hand, praying that she didn't bruise them trying to fight against my grip. I raised the phone just as she swung her head up and sank her teeth into my arm. I yelped and tightened my grip, refusing to let go of her, not knowing what she'd do. I quickly dialed 911 and shouted my address to the operator, leaving the phone on my pillow as I returned to wrestle with my wife. She's torn her eyes out, I sobbed to the operator. I don't know what's wrong with her. I'm restraining her so she can't hurt herself further. She's already bit me. I choked out, ignoring the other woman's voice in the line, trying to calm me down. It seemed like an eternity before I heard the door creak and splinter open, and a few policemen storm up the stairs, guns ready. Let go of the woman, one of them shouted at me. I can't, I sobbed back. She's already torn her own eyes out. I can't let go. They surrounded me, seeing her thrashing wildly and screaming on and on about tearing herself apart. They shouted for one of them to run down and bring a stretcher. Two men calmly moved in closer, gripping onto her arms and strategically placing their weight so that she couldn't wiggle around so much. Please, please don't hurt her, I sobbed miserably. As I stepped back and watched them restrain and strap her down on the stretcher. They injected her with something, a sedative, I found out later. By the time I climbed into the ambulance alongside her, she was out cold. I beat myself up inside as they asked me question after question. No, she doesn't have any history of panic attacks, breakdowns, or mental illness, and all she has is a skin problem. I lied about the sleeping pills, telling them she took them herself, hoping it would stop the manic scratching at night. They were calling it a psychotic break. I was worn out. I was confused and upset. I didn't know how things spiraled out of control so quickly. Once I was settled in a room, I think I passed out knowing that she was sleeping and getting help somewhere in the building, soothing me into an uneasy slumber. They roused and moved me a few times as they carted her around the hospital, and eventually I was parked in a room with my wife, heavily sedated and covered in bandages head to toe, peeking out of her loose hospital gown. Tears had dried, but now I slumped into an incredible depression, wondering what would happen next. Many of her open wounds were infected, but the doctor said they could be healed easily as long as something was done about the scratching. And eventually the scars would fade. But unfortunately her eyes could not be saved. She'd blinded herself in her mania that night. I passed out again, slumped over the bed holding my wife's hand. I slept for a while, but I woke up to the meek voice of my wife and a squeeze on my hand. "Is that you?" she murmured. I woke up, my eyes dry and itchy and my arm irritated from the scratchy sheets of the hospital bed. I squeezed her hand back. "Yeah, it's me, honey." I sounded exhausted. She sniffed. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. I wondered if she could cry without eyes, and I quickly dismissed the thought. "Everything's gonna be okay," I said, tired. I sat up and I reached for her face gently, touching the bandages and passing down to her mauled cheeks, being careful to avoid any gouges in her skin that could be sore. "I don't remember what happened," she said tearfully. "They told me earlier while you were sleeping. They told me what I did. I don't remember any of it." "Shh, it's okay. Don't cry, you'll hurt yourself. I know. I don't know what happened. We'll just have to deal with it, one step at a time. We'll get through this." I rumbled, gaining some strength and determination back in my voice. Now that we were at the doctor's, they must be able to do something. She was quiet for some time before she spoke. I didn't tell you about the voice because I didn't want you to worry. I didn't think this would happen." "The voice?" I asked, worry lacing my tone. Maybe it was a psychotic break. "It's never happened before. I've never had bad times where I needed antibiotics. I've had spots get raw and infected, but I've never had an episode where I blacked out. I've never been unaware, and I've never had a voice that encouraged me to scratch." I grew nervous, knowing there was a chance I was partly to blame for her lack of awareness by drugging her. She continued. "There's been a voice in my head for the past 2 weeks. It's quieter during the day, but it's like as soon as I'm alone or the lights go out at night, it comes around, whispering in my ear over and over again, driving me insane. Sometimes I feel like if I slipped and I wasn't paying attention, something else would take over my arms, and they would scratch for me." Being tired was a double-edged sword. I would start hearing the voice in my head during the day, but I had a bit more control. But it made nighttime worse. As I got sleepy, I could feel myself losing control to something else. She whispered, a very real fear in her voice. I'm sorry," I started, tears welling up in my eyes. "I thought I could help. I drugged your tea. I gave you sleeping pills. I just wanted you to have a chance to heal." I spilled out in a rush. She was shaking her head. "I think it knew you did. Even if I didn't," she whispered, her lips shaky. I wanted to deny that this thing existed, but I couldn't argue with her, not after what she'd been through. There were also too many things that didn't make sense. "You should have stayed asleep," I murmured, "but you didn't. You shouldn't have been able to wake up that early, but you did. And then you immediately started attacking yourself. I don't know how or why. It's tormenting me for weeks. I think it took advantage of the fact that my consciousness was asleep. I couldn't do anything to stop it. I couldn't wake up. I think it knew that it was the only chance before we would get everything checked out, but maybe it was inevitable. Maybe even with better medication, after seeing the doctor, I think maybe this would have happened no matter what." It didn't sit well with me that we were putting the blame on some mystical thing in her mind, but this didn't make any sense otherwise. I waited for the doctor so I could ask him what they believed happened. He called it sudden onset schizophrenia, explaining to me that sometimes schizophrenia patients only have one major break, while others can have several over time. I think they were dumbing it down for me, but it made enough sense for me to feel relieved. Only thing that didn't sit well with me was the doctor's answers when I asked him why the sleeping pills hadn't worked the way they should have. She must have mistaken the dose. That much should have knocked her out easily for 10 hours, he said, waving me off. We stayed in the hospital while her wounds healed, and they did some further tests examining her mental state and brain activity. They started her on antipsychotics, and her calm state set me at ease, even enough to catch up on sleep myself. I was sitting next to her hospital bed, my arms resting on the rough hospital sheets as she listened to some music through headphones. I sat up. I scratched my arms absent-mindedly, thinking that I should get up and grab a bottle of water. Scratch. It was a whisper, but it startled me. I looked over at my wife, who was still absorbed in her music. I stared at her for a minute, confused. A strange feeling crept up from my wrists to my elbows, a slow, creeping itch that felt like there were centipedes crawling their way up my arms. The need to touch my arms grew like a flame. Scratch. It'll feel so good to scratch. I swallowed heavily. I was staring directly at my wife, and the voice definitely wasn't coming from her mouth, but she'd sat up and was staring directly at me. The bandage is still covering her face. Don't. No. That one did come from my wife. A sense of panic leaked into her expression and her tone of voice. Something told me that we were both hearing it now. She'd come back to awareness, somehow realizing what was going on. She reached out to me suddenly, her hand a death grip on my arm. Her nails felt so good, digging into my skin. I wanted them to grip harder, go deeper. I wanted to scratch that deep-seated itch in my bones. My other hand twitched and raised to my forearm. Don't listen to it! Don't! Scratch. Hey there kids, and happy holidays. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you guys thank you for watching tonight's video. If you enjoy watching videos here on YouTube, then you should check out the MrCreepyPasta Storytime podcast, which is available on Spotify and on iTunes and on Google Play and everywhere like that. If you enjoy listening to MrCreepyPasta's Storytime podcast, you'll enjoy watching it on YouTube because it's the same show. You guys are both hearing the exact same thing at the exact same time. Also, thank you guys for supporting me on Patreon or on Popbase. You guys who are the top supporters on Patreon especially, thank you so much. Like Joey Gilbert, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Wayne Milstead, Chambinski, Ken Lando Higuchi, Brianna Tine-Janzen, Stephen Van Huss, Tristan Pelton, G Weevil 3, Diana Kraus, Asia, The Red Oak Shield Virus, Sandy Barney, Nico Kyle, Caleb Dougal, Daniel Paulson, Dante Rao, Last Blade Song, The Ginger Bros, Don Mewmeister, Eliminator 86, Nebsky, Finley E. Hopkins, Steampunk Sinner, Rafael Rodriguez, Optimistic Avocado, and Dr. Strawberry. Everyone there, as well as in the description down below. Thank you guys so much. If you'd like to also follow me on Popbase, where you can get a couple of different updates here and there and play games along with me, then you can do so on your phone. It's on Android and on Apple. And if you guys are looking for something like a hot beverage, such as, say, a tea for the cold winter months, then my wife is still selling teas over at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocle tea, including a Mr. Creepypasta tea that has me on it, dabbing. Don't actually, if you do order that tea, request that sticker because we made it, but she didn't want me to put it on the tea because she said it wasn't professional. I think it's whatever. Check back throughout the entirety of the holiday season for more horror stories every single day. Forever. Sweet dreams, kids.